coming months. This evening event is about taxation, as you know well, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome two leading experts in this area. Richard Murphy, who I think his fame started when he was mentioned by David Cameron in Parliament, and wrote, of course, The Joy of Sex. The Joy of Tax. I didn't mean to make that mistake, but it works quite well. The Joy of Tax, which of course is very similar. Actually, I do remember when I first started as a chartered accountant, we were I worked for Arthur Andersen, and we had all the different partners come in, and the partner who did tax came in and wrote sexy across the board. This was in 1980, so obviously the idea that tax and sex had some sort of relationship goes back some way. But I never quite understood it, but there you go. On the other hand, we have Judith Knott, who is a very experienced civil service with a senior manager in HMRC, who is now left. So you can say what you like. They can't get you.
More or less what I like.
I think it goes beyond, can't you, if you start spy scandals, you sort of some limitations.
I have to be quite careful about individual tax. Well, I can't say.
Yeah, confidentiality. Yeah. But they can't get you for.
But I can speak my mind.
You can speak your mind. Brilliant. Well, that's great. How we're going to try and play this is to make it quite a bit of a debate. So. Richard and Judith are going to start off giving a sort of overview, 10 to 15 minutes, sort of response to the politics, economics, ethics of taxation, how they see the issues. And then we're going to open the floor to questions, comments and so forth, and get a bit of a sort of debate, discussion and so on going. So hopefully that'll work really well. So at that point, I'll sit down and invite Richard. You don't have to. You can stand up or sit down, whatever you feel comfortable doing. But if you'd like to kick off.
Well, I was sitting downstairs and I said, Judith, you can go first because you've got notes and I haven't. But I'm going to start then. Fine, you've decided for me. I'm going to start. Well, good evening and thank you for coming. I'm always surprised when people come to a meeting. I don't know why, but it's always a pleasant surprise to find you turn up and there's people there to hear you. And I've taken, if you like, the structure for what I'm going to say from what you described as the subject tonight, which was the good, the bad and the ugly, I think, yes. Which I know has sort of past references, but I thought I'd split the theme into those three elements, the good, the bad and the ugly, to partly bring in the subject of economics and put tax in its broader context, and then say why I moved down towards the subject of tax havens and so on, which I've spent quite a bit of time talking about. I mean, let's start with the good, because why not? In the book The Joy of Tax, which was, of course, a deliberate Mickey take, which David Cameron fell for, silly boy, that I argue that tax is the single instrument available to government that has the greatest chance of shaping the society that we live in. That is its merit to government. You can do things with tax that, frankly, no other instrument that government has available to it can do. Even money. Even though, let me be clear, money comes first and tax comes second. So tax does not pay for government services. This is a shock to most people, but let me assure you, if the government didn't print and spend that to buy government services, there would be nothing to pay tax with. Therefore, the spend has to come first and the tax comes second. So when we're talking about the importance of taxation, can I be quite clear? There is no relationship between the spending on government services and tax, because spend comes first, the tax comes second, and we now know the two are not necessarily related. Indeed, John Redwood said so on his blog yesterday, which I tweeted out today, and over 1,000 people have picked up it, and he's not very happy about it, but that's exactly what he's admitted. The relationship has been shattered by quantitative easing. When we understand that, we do, of course, have to tax, because we have to control inflation. If we didn't tax, we would have mega inflation. Now, we don't want mega inflation, so tax controls inflation. It's a macroeconomic policy tool. But once you've decided you are going to tax, you might as well decide what else you're going to do with it. And then you can do your social policy, so you can redistribute income and wealth, and most governments around the world decide to do that. Tax havens tend to redistribute it upwards, and the rest of the world tend to redistribute it downwards. That's the fundamental difference between the two. But that's a goal. There is the purpose of correcting market failure. So we overprice alcohol and carbon and tobacco and so on. That's correcting market failure. That's a purpose for tax. We obviously have fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, controlling inflation, which is one goal, but providing stable currency. And the reason why this has value is, in fact, that you pay tax in it. That is why this thing in my hand has worth. After all, it's a piece of paper. It's worth nothing in itself. But the government will honour the promise to pay which is printed on it, because it will accept this and this alone in payment of your tax. It won't accept $1. It won't accept €1. You will have to convert those first of all, but this you can use. So it provides value to currency. Tax is fundamental to this, but it also underpins democracy. What we have discovered, and there's now a fair amount of research on this, is that when people pay tax, they are more inclined to vote. Because they think that tax is important, they want to have a say on how the policy works, and therefore there is a clear relationship between the two. Now, I suggest that those things are all for the good of society at large. We can use tax to therefore create a fairer, more equal, more balanced society where we can control the externalities like pollution and so on that obviously are harmful from market activity, whilst providing a thriving environment in which business can operate. Because there is a stable currency, there is certainty, and there are all those other things which make the mixed economy that we actually live in. Because I don't really think anybody except some wild enthusiasts believe we can live in a world where there's only the state or there's only the private sector. I very happily live in a state of grey, and quite a middling grey really, where the two mix together quite happily. It's not just the colour of my hair, as I tell my students, I actually believe in this stuff. And they're a bit shocked that they have grey-haired lecturers, but there we go. It's very shocking when you're 20. So that's the good of tax. What's the bad of tax? The bad of tax is that very large numbers of governments around the world don't seem to believe much of that. That's the big problem. First of all, they don't understand that in fact there is something called spend and tax, and they still insist that there's tax and spend, and therefore we can't do anything unless we can raise the money first, which is completely wrong. That is not the right criterion. That is why John Redwood's admission on his blog that in fact that is not true is so interesting. A right-wing conservative has just said, actually, we never needed to do austerity. There was no reason to crash the economy because we were trying to balance the books. QE did it for us just as well. He actually said 435 billion cancelled debt, which is something which no Conservative normally admits, but that's what's been said. So in other words, the governments don't understand this until suddenly, we've balanced the books and now we'll admit we never needed to do austerity to achieve that goal. But they also use tax to promote sectarian interests. I mean, I will make it quite clear, for example, that the last 7, 8 years, we've had a government that has reduced the tax on companies very heavily. It has reduced the higher rate of tax. It has reduced the tax on capital gains. It has reduced the taxes on inheritance. But it has increased overall the rates of tax on income, not enormously, but a bit, for most people, and it has significantly increased things like VAT. And it has certainly done nothing to help those who pay national insurance, and so we have a more regressive tax system today than we did in 2010. Now, I call that a bad, because we know that in an economy, inequality is bad news. Why? Because the wealthy don't spend all their income. As a matter of fact, that's how they're wealthy. If they did, they would not be wealthy. I mean, it's quite simple. And therefore, actually, if we want to have a growing economy, and we have not had a growing economy for some time of any great significance, we have to put money in the hands of those who will spend, and that is those on lower incomes. So we've got the whole policy the wrong way round. We've been actually encouraging saving, which we don't need, and we've been pushing people who are actually unable to make ends meet into debt, servitude, which is wholly inappropriate. So tax has been used for all the wrong purposes as a result. Whilst another group of countries are quite deliberately using tax as a mechanism for economic warfare. Now, those countries are tax havens, and that is exactly why tax havens exist. Let's be blunt about it. They simply exist to be an assault on the democracy of other countries. They are there to undermine the tax system of another place. Let us be clear about it. Jersey is extremely keen to collect the tax that is owing by the people who live in Jersey. In fact, it has an exceptionally draconian anti-avoidance rule. If you want to find an anti-avoidance rule which works, look at section 134A of the Jersey Tax Code, which basically says, if we think you're cheating, we'll have the money anyway. I summarise, but not by very much. That's virtually what it says. They can raise a tax charge on anyone for anything if they think they're trying to cheat the system. Now, that's pretty abusive, but that's what it says. It's especially abusive in a small island economy. But of course, they're desperately keen to undermine the UK tax system, as are all tax havens. That is what they're about. Now, we in the UK do that, let's be quite clear. We've done that by reducing our corporation tax rate. We've done that by introducing a territorial tax system, which means we've chosen not to tax the income of UK companies earned outside the UK, and so on. So we are a party to that process. And of course, if you look at the Tax Justice Network Financial Secrecy Index, you'll see that countries like the UK are quite high. A country like the USA is very high indeed. So I'm afraid to say there are governments who undertake tax competition. And tax competition is an extremely bad idea. Just because competition can be good, it does not mean that everything involving competition is necessarily so. Because the whole idea of competition is predicated on the idea that people can fail. Now, if you want failed states, go to Sudan, go to Syria, go to Yemen, and you'll see the consequences of failed states. They're pretty uncomfortable. We do not want failed states. Tax competition is quite simply deeply dangerous to society and world stability at large. And then we get to the ugly. I don't know how much more time I've got left, but I'm going to get to the ugly. What's the ugly? Well, the ugly, I'm afraid to say, are, in very large part, members of my own original profession of chartered accountant. If you want to see one group of people who are persistent presence in every major tax haven in the world, well, I can name four of them. They are, of course, PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, and EY. And I've done the research to show this. And mysteriously, they don't see any economic benefit from being in the Isle of Wight, even though there are 125,000 people there. But they see enormous benefit from being in the British Virgin Islands, where there are only 23,000 people. And that can't be because those people are so much more useful in the BVI. No, it's because it's a tax haven, and they are party to this whole process of trying to undermine the tax systems of democratic states by artificially moving profits to places where they don't arise. Now, that is deeply abusive of the right of democratic countries to choose how they wish to spend their own money. I have no problem with the British Virgin Islands having no taxes on a large part of the income earned there. If they can manage to balance their books and make their economy work that way, they have to balance their books, by the way, because they do not have their own currency, so they are not in the happy position of the UK, where we don't need to balance our books because we have our own currency. They don't, so they have to balance their books. But if they can balance their books without taxes, that's fine. I don't care. That's their choice. But they cannot export that to other places. Those who help that process of export are, in my opinion, the ugly. And I'm afraid to say a large number of lawyers, bankers and accountants have done that very deliberately, very purposefully, for private gain. And in my opinion, that is where the ethics really come in. Because we have a straightforward conflict here between the right of democratic states, the right of people to self-determination as to how their government should operate and how it should be able to spend, as opposed to the self-interest of some who've decided, no, they are more important than that right, and therefore they will choose, on behalf of those states, to undermine the tax revenues, reallocate income, increase inequality, and the result is lower rates of growth, greater degrees of stress, and of course the excuse for austerity, which has been so harmful to society at large. That is where I think the ugliness is, and that is what I think the problem we've come to face is. That is why I support measures, for example, by the OECD to tackle this issue. It's why I believe that greater transparency is fundamental to it. It's why I created the idea of country-by-country reporting, which was adopted by the OECD as one way of tackling this issue. There are others, of course, which can come up. But this is fundamental. If we're to beat Panama, if we're to beat the Caribbean states that are doing this, if we're to beat closer to home Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man and their activities in undermining, and indeed if we're going to beat some of the activities of the City of London, which so undermine social justice in this country, then I'm afraid to say we've got to have this concept of tax abuse eliminated. Now, that is not a view, by the way, which is deeply left-wing. This is actually a fundamentally pro-market view. And I make that point quite clear. What I'm trying to make clear is that there must be a level playing field. If you understand economics, and I'm quite sure it will be taught here, then one of the foundations of a market economy working is that, first of all, everybody should understand what's going on. Perfect information. Well, tax havens exist to provide imperfect information. By definition, they are therefore anti-competitive. They undermine the fairness of markets. They create unlevel playing fields that is deliberately designed to skew business interests in favour of some who can use these places against the interests of others who can't. That, again, is unethical and it's anti-business, and I believe that is one of the other reasons why this is fundamentally wrong and so ugly, because it destroys the opportunity for fair wealth creation. I think I can stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard. That's a great start.